The golden sunset cast long shadows across Helena, Montana territory, as Hope Kincaid's world collapsed with 4 simple words from Dr. Faulkner. 3 months to live. The diagnosis hung in the air of the doctor's office like a death sentence, which Hope supposed bitterly was exactly what it was. Consumption had settled deep in her lungs, and at 23, her life was nearly over before it had truly begun. "I'm sorry, Miss Kincaid," Dr. Faulkner said, his weathered face showing the fatigue of a man who had delivered too many such verdicts in his 20 years as Helena's only physician. "I wish there was something more I could do." Hope nodded numbly, her fingers clutching her handkerchief as she struggled to breathe normally, to appear composed even as her future evaporated before her eyes. She had come west with such dreams to teach, to build something of her own far from Philadelphia's crowded streets. Now, only 7 months after her arrival, she would be buried in Montana soil. "Is there anyone I should notify?" the doctor asked gently. "No," Hope replied, the word barely audible. "My parents passed last year. I have no family left." The doctor nodded sympathetically. "The boarding house where you stay, Mrs. Holloway, should be informed. You'll need care as things progress." Hope rose on unsteady legs, smoothing down her simple blue dress. "Thank you for your honesty, doctor. I'll settle your fee with Mrs. Peterson at the front." She walked out into the late June evening, the town's main street bustling with activity that seemed surreal against the backdrop of her diagnosis. How strange that the world continued turning when hers had stopped. The weight of her prognosis made each step heavier as she moved down the wooden sidewalk, mindlessly weaving through miners, merchants, and townsfolk going about their business. Lost in thought, Hope didn't notice the man until she collided with his solid chest, nearly toppling backward before strong hands steadied her. "Whoa there, Miss Kincaid," came a familiar voice tinged with concern. Hope looked up into the face of Garrett Grayson, one of Helena's most respected ranchers, despite his relatively young age of 29. His dark hair peeked out from beneath his Stetson, and those startlingly blue eyes that had caught her attention the first time she'd seen him at church services now studied her with concern. "Mr. Grayson," she managed, attempting to compose herself, "please excuse me. I wasn't watching where I was going." His hands lingered on her arms a moment longer than necessary before he released her, a frown forming on his sun-bronzed face. "You're white as a sheet. Are you unwell?" The question nearly broke her composure. She bit her lip, fighting back the sudden urge to confide in this man she barely knew beyond polite Sunday greetings and occasional encounters at the general store. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired after a long day with the children." Garrett's gaze shifted to the doctor's office she had just exited, his expression turning more serious. "You've been to see Dr. Faulkner?" It wasn't a question, and Hope felt suddenly transparent under his scrutiny. Before she could formulate a response, a coughing fit seized her, and she quickly covered her mouth with her handkerchief. When she pulled it away, she couldn't hide the specks of blood that stained the white fabric. Garrett's face darkened as understanding dawned. Without a word, he gently took her elbow. "Let me see you home, Miss Kincaid." "That's not necessary," she began, but another smaller cough interrupted her protest. "I insist," he said, his tone brooking no argument as he guided her toward Mrs. Holloway's boarding house 3 blocks away. They walked in silence, Hope acutely aware of his steady presence beside her, the way his hand occasionally brushed her back when she slowed to catch her breath. When they reached the white 2-story building with its neat flower boxes, she turned to thank him. "Mr. Grayson, Garrett," he corrected softly. "After nearly colliding on the street, I think we can dispense with formalities." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Garrett, then, thank you for escorting me, but please don't trouble yourself further." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "How bad is it?" he finally asked, his voice low enough that passers-by wouldn't hear. Hope hesitated. She hardly knew this man, yet something in his direct gaze made pretense feel pointless. 3 months, she said simply. "Perhaps less." She expected pity, the same pained look Dr. Faulkner had given her, but instead, Garrett's jaw tightened with what almost looked like determination. 3 months, he repeated, as if measuring the time in his mind. Then, surprising her completely, he asked, "What would you do with that time, Hope, if you could do anything at all?" The unexpected question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked what she wanted. Life had simply pushed her from one necessity to the next. I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't had time to think beyond today." Garrett removed his hat, revealing the full thickness of his dark hair as he ran a hand through it. "Think about it," he said, replacing his hat. "I'll call on you tomorrow if that's agreeable." Before she could form a response, he tipped his hat and strode away, leaving Hope puzzled on the boarding house steps, wondering why a man like Garrett Grayson would waste his time on a dying schoolteacher. That night, sleep eluded Hope. Between fits of coughing and racing thoughts, she found herself doing exactly what Garrett had suggested, thinking about what she might want from her remaining time. By morning, she had a modest list written in her journal, things she'd always dreamed of but never dared pursue. See the mountains up close, learn to ride a horse properly, dance under the stars, dip her feet in a mountain stream, watch a sunrise from somewhere beautiful, see a real cattle drive. Simple wishes that now seemed monumental given her dwindling strength. True to his word, Garrett appeared at the boarding house the following afternoon. Mrs. Holloway, a kindly widow in her 50s who ran the establishment with military precision, showed him to the small parlor where Hope sat reading. "Mr. Grayson to see you, Miss Kincaid," she announced, her curious gaze darting between them before she discreetly withdrew. Hope set aside her book and rose to greet him, immediately noticing how he filled the modest parlor with his presence. He'd exchanged yesterday's work clothes for a clean shirt and vest, though he still wore his worn leather boots. "Miss Kincaid," he greeted with a slight bow of his head. "You're looking better today." She appreciated the lie. The mirror had shown her pale face and the dark circles beneath her eyes that morning. "Thank you for calling, Mr. Grayson, though I'm curious as to why." "Garrett," he reminded her with the hint of a smile. "And I've come with a proposition." Hope raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to take a seat across from her. "A proposition," he sat, placing his hat on his knee. "I've been thinking about what you told me about the time you have left." His direct approach might have seemed tactless from another, but from him it was refreshingly honest. "You shouldn't spend it cooped up in town, waiting." "Waiting to die, you mean," Hope said quietly. "Waiting to live," he corrected firmly. 3 months is still time, Hope. Enough time to see some of what Montana has to offer, to experience things you might have missed. She studied him, perplexed by his interest. "Why would you concern yourself with how I spend my remaining days? We've hardly exchanged more than pleasantries before yesterday." Garrett leaned forward, his blue eyes intent. "My sister had consumption," he said, his voice lower. 2 years ago. She spent her final months afraid, hiding away from life. I've regretted not doing more for her every day since." He paused. "I can't change that now, but maybe I can help someone else live what time they have left to the fullest." The raw honesty in his voice touched her deeply. "I'm sorry about your sister," Hope said, "but I'm just a schoolteacher. I have responsibilities and limited means. Grand adventures aren't really possible." "The school term ended last week," Garrett pointed out, "and as for means, that's where my proposition comes in. My ranch is 15 miles outside of town in some of the most beautiful country you'll ever see. I'm offering to show you Montana, the real Montana, not just what you can see from Helena's streets." Hope stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You're suggesting I come to your ranch?" "I'm suggesting you let me help you experience some of the things you've never had a chance to do," he clarified. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, is there, so proprieties would be observed. You'd have your own room in the main house." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, Hope hardly knew how to respond. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition," Garrett interrupted gently. "My ranch hands and I will be busy with summer work, but there would still be time to show you the mountains, teach you to ride properly if you'd like. The point is, you'd be free to spend your days however you choose, not confined by what's expected of a town schoolteacher. Hope hesitated, torn between the conventions she'd always followed and the sudden, fierce desire to accept his offer. People would talk. A slight smile curved his lips. People always talk. In 3 months, will that matter to you? The blunt question struck her with the force of truth. What did she care for gossip now? No, she admitted. I suppose it won't. Then you'll come. There was an eagerness in his voice that surprised her. Hope took a deep breath, feeling a strange lightness she hadn't experienced since the doctor's diagnosis. Yes, she said, the decision suddenly easy. Yes, I'll come. Garrett's smile transformed his face, making him look younger, less careworn. Good, I'll make arrangements. We can leave the day after tomorrow if that suits you. As he stood to take his leave, Hope was struck by a question. Garrett, you asked me yesterday what I would do if I could do anything. May I ask what made you think to ask that? He paused at the parlor doorway, his expression softening. Because no one asked my sister that question when they should have. Everyone was so busy being sad about her dying that they forgot she was still living. He placed his hat on his head. I'll see you on Thursday morning, Hope. Pack light, anything else you need, we can provide. After he left, Hope sat motionless in the parlor, her mind reeling from the unexpected turn of events. She had come to terms with dying in her small rented room at the boarding house. Now, suddenly, the prospect of spending her final months at Garrett Grayson's ranch, experiencing Montana's wild beauty, filled her with something she'd thought lost forever: anticipation. That evening, she informed Mrs. Holloway of her plans, weathering the older woman's concerns and barely veiled disapproval with a newfound resolve. By the next afternoon, word had spread through Helena's gossip channels, and several well-meaning townswomen had called to express their concern for Hope's reputation. Hope received them all politely but firmly in the boarding house parlor, explaining that with her health failing, conventional concerns about propriety seemed less important than living what remained of her life on her own terms. Most left unsatisfied with her explanation, but Hope found she cared less than she would have before her diagnosis. Thursday morning dawned clear and warm. Hope dressed in her most practical skirt and blouse, her few belongings packed in a single trunk. She had just finished breakfast when Mrs. Holloway announced Garrett's arrival. He stood in the foyer, hat in hand, looking impossibly handsome in a fresh blue shirt that matched his eyes. Behind him, through the open door, Hope could see a wagon rather than the horseback she'd expected. Good morning, he greeted, a smile warming his features. Are you ready for an adventure, Miss Kincaid? Despite her nervousness, Hope couldn't help returning his smile. As ready as I'll ever be, Mr. Grayson. Mrs. Holloway hovered nearby as Garrett loaded Hope's trunk into the wagon. You're certain about this, dear? She whispered to Hope. It's not too late to change your mind. Hope watched Garrett as he efficiently secured her trunk. I'm certain, she said with quiet confidence, but thank you for your concern. Garrett helped Hope into the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist as he lifted her to the seat. The casual strength in that simple action reminded her how illness had weakened her once healthy frame. Comfortable? He asked, climbing up beside her. Hope nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what she was doing. She was leaving the safety of town to spend what remained of her life with a man she barely knew, all because he'd offered her a chance to truly live before she died. Garrett must have sensed her momentary panic because he reached over and briefly covered her gloved hand with his. Trust me, he said simply, then took up the reins and clicked to the horses. As they pulled away from the boarding house, Hope caught glimpses of curious faces in shop windows and on the sidewalk. Helena was small enough that her departure with the handsome rancher would be discussed over dinner tables throughout town that evening. Once they cleared the town limits, Hope found herself relaxing. The day was beautiful, the sky an endless blue canopy overhead, with distant mountains shimmering on the horizon. The road followed the gentle contours of the land, and wildflowers dotted the prairie grasses on either side. "It's beautiful," she said, breathing deeply of the clean summer air. Even as the action triggered a small cough, she couldn't regret it. "This is nothing compared to what you'll see," Garrett promised, his profile strong against the landscape as he handled the team with practiced ease. The ranch is nestled at the foot of the mountains. The view from the front porch is worth the trip alone. They talked easily as the miles passed, Garrett pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area, while Hope told him about her childhood in Philadelphia and her journey west after her parents' deaths. "Why Montana?" he asked as they stopped to rest the horses beside a small creek. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I wanted something different," Hope said, walking carefully to the creek's edge to watch the clear water bubble over smooth stones. "Something vast and untamed." Philadelphia was all buildings and streets and people pressed too closely together. "I saw an advertisement for teachers needed in Montana territory, and it seemed like the answer to a prayer I hadn't even known I was saying." Garrett nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And was it what you hoped for?" Hope looked around at the expansive landscape, the distant mountains, the endless sky. "Yes," she said softly. "Even now, knowing what's ahead, I don't regret coming." They continued their journey after the brief rest, the conversation flowing comfortably between moments of companionable silence. By early afternoon, Hope caught her first glimpse of the Grayson Ranch in the distance, a large two-story house with several outbuildings, all nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered foothills that rose toward majestic mountains beyond. "Welcome to Evergreen Ranch," Garrett said, a note of pride in his voice as he guided the wagon down the long drive toward the house. As they drew closer, Hope could see details that spoke of care and prosperity: the well-maintained fences, the flower beds flanking the house, the large barn with fresh paint. A few ranch hands paused in their work to wave as the wagon passed. A plump, gray-haired woman emerged onto the wide front porch as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's Mrs. Abernathy," Garrett explained. "Been with me since I started the ranch 6 years ago. Best cook in the territory and runs the house like a general." He drew the wagon to a halt before the house and jumped down, coming around to help Hope descend. Her legs felt stiff from the journey, and she was grateful for his steadying hand. "Mrs. Abernathy, this is Miss Hope Kincaid," Garrett introduced as they approached the porch. "She'll be our guest for a while." The older woman's keen eyes took in Hope's pale complexion and slight frame with motherly concern. "Welcome to Evergreen, Miss Kincaid. I've prepared the blue room for you. It has the best view of the mountains." She turned to Garrett. "Thomas can bring in her trunk. You both must be parched after that drive. I've got lemonade cooling in the springhouse." Hope was immediately charmed by the housekeeper's no-nonsense manner and the warmth beneath it. "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy. I hope my presence won't be too much trouble." The older woman waved away her concern. "No trouble at all. It'll be nice having another woman around this place." She cast a significant glance at Garrett. "This one works too hard and talks too little. Maybe you'll be a good influence." Garrett shook his head with a smile. "Don't believe a word she says, Hope. Mrs. Abernathy thinks anyone who rises after 5 in the morning is lazy." The banter between them spoke of long familiarity and genuine affection. Hope followed them into the house, immediately struck by how comfortable and welcoming it felt. The main room was spacious, with large windows that bathed the polished wood floors in sunlight. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while bookshelves lined another. The furniture was sturdy and well-crafted, clearly chosen for comfort rather than show. "Your home is lovely," Hope said, genuinely impressed. "Built it myself with help," Garrett replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "Expanded it last year. Come, I'll show you to your room so you can rest before dinner." He led her up a wide staircase to the second floor, where a hallway ran the length of the house with doors opening off either side. He opened the second door on the right, revealing a charming bedroom painted a soft blue, with a large bed covered in a handmade quilt and a window seat overlooking the mountains. Mrs. Abernathy was right. This is the best view in the house, Hope said, moving to the window to gaze out at the panorama of foothills and mountains beyond. I thought you'd like it, Garrett said, standing in the doorway. There's a washroom at the end of the hall. Thomas will bring up your trunk shortly. Dinner's usually at 6, but if you're tired from the journey, Mrs. Abernathy can bring a tray up. Hope turned from the window, touched by his consideration. Thank you, but I think I'll manage dinner. I've been sitting all day after all. Garrett nodded, his eyes lingering on her face. Rest now. We can talk more about what you'd like to do during your stay over dinner. After he left, Hope sank onto the window seat, overwhelmed by the day's events and the kindness of this man who owed her nothing. Outside the window, the landscape stretched before her, wild, beautiful, and full of possibilities she'd never thought to experience. For the first time since the doctor's verdict, Hope felt a flutter of something like joy, true to Garrett's word. Dinner that evening was a pleasant affair. The dining room was warm and inviting, with windows open to catch the evening breeze. Mrs. Abernathy had prepared a feast: roast chicken, fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, and warm bread that melted in Hope's mouth. Though her appetite had been poor lately, Hope found herself enjoying the meal, encouraged by Garrett's obvious pleasure in seeing her eat. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I thought I might show you around the ranch, Garrett suggested as they shared apple pie for dessert. Nothing strenuous, we can take the buggy. I'd like that, Hope said, trying to suppress a cough that threatened to interrupt her words. Dr. Faulkner said moderate activity wouldn't hurt and might even help for a while. Garrett's expression darkened momentarily at the reminder of her illness, but he quickly recovered. Good, and if there's anything specific you'd like to do or see, you have only to mention it. Hope hesitated, then decided to be bold. Actually, there is something. She explained about the list she'd made the night after his first visit, her modest wishes for experiences she'd never had. Garrett listened intently, a smile growing as she spoke. When she finished, he leaned forward, his blue eyes alight with purpose. Consider it done, all of it and more. You don't even know what's on my list, Hope protested with a small laugh. It doesn't matter, he said with quiet certainty. Whatever it is, we'll make it happen. Later that night, lying in the comfortable bed beneath the handmade quilt, Hope reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been a respectable schoolteacher with a future, however modest. Now she was a dying woman staying at a bachelor's ranch, throwing propriety to the wind in favor of truly living her remaining days. The thought should have troubled her more than it did. Instead, as she drifted towards sleep with the cool mountain air flowing through her open window, Hope felt a sense of rightness, as if she had finally found where she belonged, even if only for a short time. The following weeks passed in a blur of new experiences. True to his word, Garrett devoted himself to fulfilling Hope's modest list of wishes whenever his ranch duties allowed. The day after her arrival, he showed her the ranch, the barns and corrals, the bunkhouse where his hands stayed, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of his property, and the fields where his cattle grazed in the distance. By the end of her first week, Garrett had taught her to ride properly on a gentle mare named Daisy. Hope had never experienced such freedom as she did cantering across open meadows, the wind in her hair, Garrett riding beside her on his stallion midnight. You're a natural, he told her after one such ride, his eyes warm with admiration as he helped her dismount. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, a happening that was becoming increasingly common. I had an excellent teacher, Hope replied, breathless from the exertion and from his closeness. July progressed into August, and with each passing day, Hope found herself falling in love with Montana's rugged beauty, with the simple rhythms of ranch life, and increasingly, with Garrett Grayson himself. He was unlike any man she had ever known, strong yet gentle, hardworking yet thoughtful, commanding respect from his men without ever raising his voice. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his place in the world, who had built something meaningful with his own two hands. And though neither of them spoke of it, Hope sensed his growing feelings for her in 100 small ways, the touch of his hand helping her into the buggy, the books from his personal library that appeared on her bedside table, chosen with her interests in mind, the way he listened intently whenever she spoke, as if her thoughts were treasures to be carefully considered. Mrs. Abernathy observed their growing closeness with knowing eyes, but said nothing, simply ensuring that Hope had everything she needed and that propriety was maintained, at least in the technical sense. "He's different with you here," the housekeeper confided one afternoon as they prepared vegetables for dinner. "Lighter somehow. I haven't seen him smile this much since before his sister passed." Hope's heart constricted at the mention of Garrett's sister, whose fate so mirrored her own. "He's been very kind to me." Mrs. Abernathy gave her a shrewd look. "It's more than kindness, dear. Surely you can see that." Hope could see it, that was the problem. With each passing day, as they checked items off her list of wishes, she found herself wishing for the one thing she couldn't have: a future with Garrett Grayson. They had seen the sun rise from a mountain ridge, Garrett wrapping her in a blanket against the pre-dawn chill. They had watched a small cattle drive as Garrett's men moved a herd to summer pasture. He had taught her to fish in the clear mountain streams, laughing at her startled delight when she caught her first trout. One evening in mid-August, Garrett surprised her by taking her to a neighboring ranch where a barn dance was being held. He had mentioned it casually at breakfast, asking if she felt strong enough to attend. "A dance?" Hope had asked, surprised and delighted. "That's on my list, to dance under the stars." "I know," Garrett had replied with a smile. "Mrs. Abernathy helped me find something suitable for you to wear. It's laid out in your room." The something suitable turned out to be a lovely blue dress that complemented her eyes and had clearly been altered to fit her diminished frame. Hope had stared at it in wonder, touched beyond words by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. That night, under a canopy of stars with lanterns strung around the Andersons' barn, Garrett had held her close as they danced to the fiddle music. Hope had never felt so alive, so present in a moment as she did in his arms, moving to the music despite the occasional need to stop and catch her breath. "You're beautiful," Garrett had whispered during one such pause, his eyes reflecting the lantern light. "The most beautiful woman here tonight." Hope had blushed, knowing her illness had robbed her of whatever beauty she might once have possessed, but treasuring his words nonetheless. "You don't have to say that." "I never say things I don't mean," he'd replied seriously, his hand warm against the small of her back. "You should know that about me by now." As August waned, Hope knew her time was growing shorter. The symptoms Dr. Faulkner had warned about were becoming more pronounced: increased weakness, more frequent coughing fits, night sweats that left her exhausted. She tried to hide the worst of it from Garrett, not wanting to burden him with the reality of her decline, but he noticed everything. One morning in late August, Hope woke feeling particularly weak. She had suffered through a difficult night, coughing until her throat was raw. When she didn't appear for breakfast, Garrett came to check on her, knocking softly before entering at her faint "come in." He took one look at her pale face, and the handkerchief spotted with blood clutched in her hand, and his expression hardened with determination. "I'm taking you to see Dr. Faulkner," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "There's no point," Hope said wearily. "He can't help me, maybe not, but he can give you something for the pain and the cough." Garrett's voice softened as he sat on the edge of her bed, taking her free hand in his. "Please, Hope. Let me do this for you." Unable to refuse him anything, Hope had agreed. The trip to Helena had been difficult, even in the comfortable buggy with pillows to support her. Dr. Faulkner had been surprised to see how well she looked overall, given that 2 months had passed since his dire diagnosis. "The mountain air agrees with you," he'd observed after examining her. "You're doing better than I would have expected, though the disease is progressing." He had provided medicines to ease her symptoms and advised moderate rest, but encouraged her to continue activities that brought her joy. "Quality of life matters as much as its length," he'd said kindly. On the journey back to the ranch, Garrett had been unusually quiet, his expression thoughtful. When they were about halfway home, he suddenly pulled the buggy to a stop beneath the shade of a large cottonwood tree. "Hope," he said, turning to face her fully. "I need to say something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." Surprised by his serious tone, Hope nodded, her heart quickening despite her fatigue. Garrett took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "These past 2 months have been the best of my life," he began, his voice low and intense. "Having you at Evergreen, seeing Montana through your eyes, watching you embrace each day despite knowing what's coming, it's changed me. You've changed me." Hope felt tears gathering, but she remained silent as promised. "I know our time is limited," he continued, reaching for her hand. "I know what the doctor said today, but I don't want to waste a single moment we have left with regrets or things unsaid." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "I love you, Hope Kincaid. I think I started falling in love with you that first day on the street in Helena, and every day since has only made me love you more." A tear slipped down Hope's cheek, as his words washed over her words she had longed to hear but had not dared hope for. "You don't have to say anything," Garrett continued, his thumb gently wiping away her tear. "I'm not asking for promises. I just needed you to know that whatever time we have, whether it's weeks or months or some miracle, I want to spend it loving you openly, not hiding what I feel." Hope's throat tightened with emotion. "Garrett," she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "loving me can only bring you pain." "Loving you brings me joy," he countered firmly. "The pain will come regardless when we lose you. But I would rather have the joy of loving you now than the regret of never having told you." Hope closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the gift he was offering, the chance to love and be loved, even in the shadow of her approaching death. When she opened them again, her decision was made. "I love you too," she said simply. "I've tried not to. I've told myself it isn't fair to you, but I can't help it." The smile that illuminated Garrett's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Without a word, he leaned forward and kissed her gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded to him, her arms winding around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathless for reasons that had nothing to do with illness, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said softly. Hope pulled back, stunned. "Garrett, no, I'm dying. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm asking," he interrupted. "I want whatever time we have left to be as husband and wife. I want to fall asleep beside you every night and wake up with you every morning for however long we're given." "But no buts," he said firmly. "Life offers no guarantees, Hope. Any of us could die tomorrow. The only thing that matters is how we choose to live today." He took both her hands in his. "Marry me. Let me love you properly, completely, for whatever time we have." Faced with such certainty, such love, Hope found her objections melting away. "Yes," she whispered, her heart full to bursting. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed 3 days later in the small church in Helena, with Mrs. Abernathy, Reverend Thomas, and a few of Garrett's closest ranch hands as witnesses. Hope wore a simple cream dress that Mrs. Abernathy had altered overnight, with wildflowers in her hair. Garrett looked impossibly handsome in his best suit, his eyes never leaving Hope's face as they spoke their vows. The townspeople were scandalized. Of course, a dying woman marrying a wealthy rancher after living in his home for months. The whispers followed them through town as Garrett helped his new bride into the buggy after the ceremony. "You regret it?" Hope asked softly as they drove away from Helena, the town's steeples receding behind them. "Making yourself the subject of gossip." Garrett's hand covered hers on the seat between them. "I could never regret marrying the woman I love," he said simply. "Let them talk. We know the truth of what we feel." Their wedding night was a revelation. Despite her illness, despite her weakened condition, Hope had never felt more alive than she did in Garrett's arms. He was tender and patient, his touch awakening sensations she had never imagined possible. When they finally lay together in the afterglow, her head pillowed on his chest, Hope felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "Why are you crying?" Garrett asked gently, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Because I'm happy," Hope replied truthfully. "Because I never thought I could be this happy, especially after the doctor's verdict." Garrett's arms tightened around her. "We'll make every day count," he promised. "Every single one." True to his word, the weeks that followed were filled with joy despite Hope's gradually failing health. They completed her list of wishes and added new ones. They rode together in the early mornings when Hope felt strongest, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. They read to each other in the evenings by the fire, sharing favorite passages from beloved books. They made love whenever Hope had the strength, each time a celebration of life and the love they had found against all odds. As September gave way to October, the mountain air turned crisp, and the aspen trees blazed gold against the evergreens. Hope found herself tiring more easily, the coughing fits becoming more frequent and severe. But still, she treasured each day, each moment with Garrett, storing up memories like gold coins. One crisp October afternoon, Garrett found Hope sitting on the front porch swing, bundled in blankets against the autumn chill, gazing out at the mountains. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Grayson," he said, settling beside her and drawing her close to his side. Hope smiled at the name she was still getting used to. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am," she said honestly. 3 months ago, I thought my life was over. Instead, I found you, and you've given me more happiness in these short weeks than most people find in a lifetime." Garrett pressed a kiss to her temple. "I'm the lucky one," he murmured against her hair. "You've brought light and joy into my life, Hope. This house was just a building before you came. You made it a home." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. When the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Hope turned to her husband, her face serious. "I want you to promise me something," she said quietly. Garrett met her gaze. "Anything." "When I'm gone," she began, placing a finger over his lips when he started to protest. "When I'm gone, I want you to live, really live. Don't close yourself off from happiness because you lost me. Find joy again, maybe even love again someday." Garrett's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Hope, promise me," she insisted. "It would break my heart to think of you alone forever." After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "I promise to try," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "but you should know that no one will ever replace you in my heart. A part of me will always be yours, no matter what." Hope leaned into him, satisfied with his answer. "I can accept that," she whispered. That night, as they lay together in their bed, Garrett held Hope close, listening to her breathing shallower than it had been even a week ago, but steady for now. He pressed a kiss to her hair, inhaling her scent, committing it to memory. "I love you, Hope Grayson," he murmured. "And I love you," she responded sleepily. "Forever." As October progressed, Hope's decline accelerated. There were good days when she could still sit on the porch, or even take a short walk with Garrett's support. But there were also increasingly bad days when she could barely leave their bed, racked by coughing fits that left her exhausted and in pain. Through it all, Garrett was her rock, tending to her with gentle hands, reading to her when she was too weak to hold a book, carrying her to the window so she could see the mountains when she couldn't walk that far herself. Mrs. Abernathy prepared special broths and teas to soothe Hope's throat and provide what nourishment she could still take. Dr. Faulkner rode out from Helena twice during this period, providing stronger medicines for Hope's comfort, but confirming what they already knew: her time was growing very short. After his second visit in late October, when Hope was resting, the doctor spoke privately to Garrett in his study. "Days, not weeks," he said gravely. "I'm sorry, Mr. Grayson. She's fought hard, lasted longer than I would have predicted, but the disease has progressed significantly." Garrett nodded, his face a mask of control even as his heart shattered anew. "She's not in too much pain. The laudanum helps," Dr. Faulkner assured him, "and your care has been exemplary." She couldn't ask for better in her final days. After the doctor left, Garrett stood alone in his study, fighting for composure before returning to Hope. He had known this was coming, had known from the start that their time together would be brief, but the reality of it still struck him like a physical blow. The thought of Evergreen without Hope, of waking up to an empty space beside him where she should be, was almost unbearable. But he had promised her he would be strong, and he would keep that promise. Taking a deep breath, he went back upstairs to their bedroom. Hope was awake, looking out the window at the mountains she had come to love. She turned at his entrance, her face lighting up with a smile that, though weaker than before, still had the power to stop his heart. "You've been talking to Dr. Faulkner," she said, seeing something in his expression. Garrett crossed to sit beside her on the bed, taking her thin hand in his. "Yes," he admitted, knowing she would want honesty. Hope nodded, unsurprised. "It won't be long now," she said softly. "I can feel it." Garrett's throat tightened, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "Are you afraid?" Hope considered the question seriously. "Not of dying, exactly," she said after a moment. "More of leaving you, of not being here to see the changing seasons, to grow old with you as we planned that day under the cottonwood." Tears stung Garrett's eyes. "We'll be together again," he said with certainty. "If not in this life, then in whatever comes after. I believe that with all my heart." Hope's smile was radiant despite her pallor. "So do I." The following days passed in a blur of quiet moments, Garrett reading Hope's favorite poems aloud, Mrs. Abernathy bringing small treats that might tempt Hope's failing appetite. Ranch hands stopping by individually to say gentle goodbyes to the young woman who had brightened their employer's life. On a crystal-clear morning in early November, Hope woke feeling strangely energized, the pain that had been her constant companion temporarily muted. When Garrett realized she was having a good day, he acted on a plan he had been forming. "I want to take you somewhere," he said, sitting beside her on the bed. "If you feel strong enough." Hope nodded eagerly. "I'd like that. I've been cooped up inside for so long." Carefully, Garrett helped her dress in warm layers against the November chill. Then, gathering her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, which, he realized with a pang, was nearly true, he carried her downstairs and outside where the buggy waited, prepared with thick blankets and pillows for her comfort. "Where are we going?" Hope asked as Garrett carefully settled her in the buggy, tucking blankets around her. "It's a surprise," he said with a smile that almost reached his eyes, "but not far." He drove slowly, mindful of every bump that might jar her fragile frame, taking a path that wound up into the foothills behind the ranch. After about 20 minutes, they reached a small plateau overlooking the valley, where Evergreen Ranch was spread out below them like a painting, with mountains rising majestically beyond. "Oh, Garrett," Hope breathed, taking in the panoramic view. "It's beautiful." "I wanted you to see it," he said, helping her from the buggy and carrying her to a spot where he had already laid out a thick quilt. He settled her carefully, then sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders supporting her. "This is my favorite place on the whole ranch. I come here to think, to make decisions. I've never brought anyone else here before." Hope leaned against him, drawing strength from his warmth. "Thank you for sharing it with me." They sat in peaceful silence, watching clouds cast shadows across the valley below, the November sun warm on their faces despite the crisp air. Hope's breathing was labored but steady, her thin body nestled securely against Garrett's side. "Are you happy, Hope?" Garrett asked suddenly, his voice low. "With the life we've had together, short as it's been, do you have regrets?" Hope turned her face up to his, her eyes luminous despite the shadows beneath them. "My only regret is that we didn't have more time," she said honestly. "But these months with you have been worth a lifetime of ordinary days. You made good on your promise, Garrett. You gave me the best 3 months anyone could ask for." Garrett's arm tightened around her. "I wish I could give you more. Years. Decades." "You gave me everything," Hope whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "Love, joy, adventure. Memories I'll carry with me wherever I go next. They stayed on the plateau until the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. When Hope began to shiver despite the blankets, Garrett knew it was time to return to the house. That night, Hope's condition worsened dramatically. The energy that had allowed for their outing vanished, replaced by weakness so profound she could barely lift her hand. Garrett sat beside her through the night, holding her hand, whispering words of love and comfort as her breathing became increasingly labored. Mrs. Abernathy came and went quietly, bringing fresh water and clean cloths, her lined face showing the same grief that tore at Garrett's heart. As dawn approached, Hope opened her eyes, finding Garrett's face in the dim light of the bedside lamp. "Garrett," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I need you to know something." "I'm here," he said, leaning closer. "Tell me, my love. You saved me," she said, each word an effort. "Not from dying, no one could do that, but from dying without having lived. You gave me life, real life and love. I'm not afraid now." Tears fell unchecked down Garrett's face as he pressed his lips to her forehead. "I will love you always, Hope Grayson, in this life and beyond." A small smile touched Hope's lips. "And I will love you. Wait for me when your time comes. I'll be there." "I'll wait," he promised, his voice breaking. "However long it takes." Hope's eyes drifted closed, her breathing growing more shallow with each passing moment. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, painting the room in soft gold, Hope Grayson took her final breath, her hand still clasped in her husband's. Garrett sat motionless, holding her hand long after it had grown cold, his heart too shattered for tears. Outside the window, the mountains stood silent witness to his grief, their peaks catching the first rays of a sun Hope would never see again. Hope was laid to rest on a hillside overlooking Evergreen Ranch, beneath a towering pine tree where wildflowers bloomed in summer. The small funeral was attended by those who had come to love her in her brief time in Montana, Mrs. Abernathy, the ranch hands, Reverend Thomas, and a few townspeople who had seen past gossip to the beautiful love story that had unfolded before them. After the others had gone, Garrett remained by the fresh grave, a solitary figure against the November sky. Mrs. Abernathy approached cautiously, laying a motherly hand on his arm. "She wouldn't want you to grieve too long," the housekeeper said gently. "She told me so herself before the end." Garrett nodded, unable to speak past the knot in his throat. "Come back to the house now," Mrs. Abernathy continued. "There'll be time enough for sitting with memories. She'd want you to go on living, she was very clear about that." Slowly, Garrett turned from the grave, allowing the older woman to lead him back down the hill toward the ranch house that now felt emptier than he could have imagined possible. The months that followed were the darkest of Garrett's life. Winter descended on Montana with its usual ferocity, blanketing Hope's grave in pristine snow. Garrett threw himself into work, rising before dawn and collapsing into exhausted sleep long after dark, trying to outrun grief that followed him like a shadow. Mrs. Abernathy watched over him with worried eyes, making sure he ate, speaking Hope's name often so he would know it was not forbidden, leaving Hope's books where he would see them small reminders that she had been real, that their love had been real, despite its brevity. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, healing began. One evening in late February, Garrett found himself pausing by the bookshelf, running his fingers over the spine of Wuthering Heights, Hope's favorite novel. Instead of the sharp pain such moments had brought before, he felt a gentle ache, a bittersweet remembrance. That night, he took the book to bed with him, opening it to find Hope's delicate handwriting in the margins, little comments and reactions that brought her voice vividly to his mind. He fell asleep with the book on his chest, and for the first time since her death, his dreams were of happy memories rather than loss. Spring came to Montana in fits and starts, bringing with it new life and renewed purpose. On the first truly warm day in April, Garrett rode up to the plateau where he had taken Hope months before. Sitting there alone, looking out over his land, he felt her presence more strongly than he had since her passing. "I'm trying, Hope," he said aloud to the empty air. "I'm trying to live like I promised you I would." The breeze that ruffled his hair felt almost like a caress, and for the first time in months, Garrett smiled a real smile that reached his eyes. That evening, he returned to the ranch with a decision made: gathering Mrs. Abernathy and his ranch hands, he announced his intention to establish a small school on the ranch property. "For the children of the ranch hands and neighboring homesteads," he explained. "They have to travel too far to Helena for proper schooling. We'll build it near the East Meadow and name it for my wife the Hope Grayson School." The idea sparked enthusiasm among his men, many of whom had children who received only sporadic education when they could be spared from farm work. Within weeks, construction had begun, with Garrett working alongside his hands to raise the simple but sturdy building that would honor Hope's legacy as a teacher. By September of 1883, almost a year after Hope's death, the school was completed and a young teacher hired from back east. On the day it opened, Garrett stood outside watching children file in, their faces bright with excitement. Above the door hung a small brass plaque: "Hope Grayson School, where dreams take flight." As the last child disappeared inside, Garrett felt a sense of peace settle over him. Hope was gone, but something of her remained in this place, in these children who would learn and grow because of a dream born from love. Later that day, Garrett rode up to Hope's grave on the hillside. Wildflowers nodded in the September breeze as he sat beside the simple headstone, running his fingers over the carved letters of her name. "The school opened today," he told her, as he often spoke to her when he visited. "You would have loved seeing those children, Hope. They remind me of how you described your students in Helena, eager and full of possibilities." The wind whispered through the pine branches overhead, a sound that had come to feel like Hope's answer to his one-sided conversations. "I miss you every day," Garrett continued softly. "But I'm keeping my promise. I'm living, Hope, building something that matters, something that would make you proud." As he sat there in the golden afternoon light, Garrett felt the crushing weight of grief lighten a little more. Hope had given him 3 extraordinary months of her life, and in return, he would give her a legacy that would touch generations to come. Rising to his feet, Garrett pressed his fingers to his lips, then to the top of the headstone, a ritual he had developed over the past year. "I love you, Hope Grayson," he said, "always and forever." Then he mounted his horse and rode back down the hill toward Evergreen Ranch, toward the future Hope had made him promise to embrace. Behind him, wildflowers bobbed in the breeze, and somewhere, Garrett liked to believe, Hope was smiling. The years passed, changing Evergreen Ranch as they changed Montana itself. The territory became a state in 1889, bringing new settlers and development. The Hope Grayson School thrived, eventually expanding to accommodate more students as ranching families populated the area around Helena. Garrett remained a bachelor, devoted to his ranch and his school, though not without opportunities to change that status. Several widows and unmarried women from Helena made their interest known over the years, but Garrett politely deflected their attentions. His heart remained with Hope, buried on the hillside beneath the pine tree. In the spring of 1893, 10 years after Hope's death, a young woman arrived in Helena seeking work as a teacher. Elizabeth Morgan, recently graduated from a teaching college in Boston, had come west seeking adventure and purpose. When she heard about the Hope Grayson School and its founder, she applied immediately for a position that had opened due to the previous teacher's marriage. Garrett, now approaching 40 but still handsome and vital, interviewed Elizabeth himself, as he did all potential teachers. Something about her reminded him of Hope, not her appearance. For Elizabeth was tall with auburn hair where Hope had been petite and blonde, but a similar spirit of determination and joy. He hired her on the spot, and over the next year, a friendship developed between them. Elizabeth loved hearing stories about Hope and the school's origins, never showing jealousy of the woman who still held such a place in Garrett's heart. She must have been remarkable. Elizabeth said one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house after a school board meeting. To have inspired such devotion. She was, Garrett agreed, his voice soft with memory. She taught me how to truly live even knowing she was dying. That kind of courage changes a person forever. Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. I think she would be proud of what you've built here. Not just the school, but the community around it. These children are growing up with opportunities many in the East don't have, despite all their advantages. Her understanding touched Garrett deeply. For the first time in many years, he found himself thinking of Hope's final request that he find joy again, perhaps even love. The thought no longer felt like betrayal. As spring turned to summer, Garrett began to court Elizabeth properly, with buggy rides and picnics by the creek. When he finally kissed her beneath an August moon, he felt both joy in the present and a sense that Hope would approve. On a golden October afternoon in 1894, 11 years after he had lost Hope, Garrett took Elizabeth to the plateau overlooking the ranch, the special place he had once shared only with his first wife. It's breathtaking, Elizabeth said, turning in a slow circle to take in the panoramic view. I can see why you love it here. I brought Hope here near the end, Garrett said quietly. It was our last real outing together. He had never hidden his past from Elizabeth, and she had never asked him to. Elizabeth took his hand, her eyes full of understanding. Thank you for sharing it with me too. Garrett drew her into his arms, looking into eyes that had come to mean so much to him. Before she died, Hope made me promise something. She made me promise that I would live fully, that I wouldn't close myself off from happiness or even love. Elizabeth waited, her expression open and patient. For a long time, I wasn't ready to keep that part of my promise, Garrett continued. I built the school, I kept going, but I kept my heart locked away. His hand came up to cup her cheek. Until you. Tears shimmered in Elizabeth's eyes. Garrett, I will always love Hope, he said honestly. She was my first love and part of my heart will always be hers, but I've found that the heart has an amazing capacity to expand. My love for her doesn't diminish what I feel for you. He took a deep breath. I love you, Elizabeth Morgan. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Elizabeth's smile was radiant through her tears. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I would be proud to be your wife, to help you continue the legacy you and Hope began. They were married that Christmas in the small church in Helena, the same church where Garrett had married Hope 11 years earlier. After the ceremony, before joining their guests at the reception, Garrett took his new bride to the hillside where Hope was buried. Standing before the headstone, Garrett's arm around Elizabeth's waist, they stood in respectful silence for a moment. I wanted to bring you here first, Garrett explained, to introduce you properly in a way. Elizabeth leaned into him, understanding what this moment meant to him. Thank you for that. Garrett looked down at the grave of his first wife, emotion tightening his throat. Hope, he said softly, I kept my promise. I've found joy again and love. This is Elizabeth, my wife. She teaches at your school and the children adore her. I think you would have too. Elizabeth knelt and placed a small bouquet of winter flowers at the base of the headstone. Thank you, she whispered, for the man he is, for the school that brought us together, and for making him promise to find happiness again. As they turned to leave hand in hand, the setting sun broke through winter clouds, casting a golden glow over the hillside. Garrett felt a sense of completion, of promises kept and new beginnings blessed. Hope had given him 3 extraordinary months of her life, changing him forever. Now, with Elizabeth, he would honor that gift by living fully for all the years to come. The Hope Grayson School continued to thrive, educating generations of Montana children long after its namesake was gone. Garrett and Elizabeth eventually had 2 children of their own, a son named William and a daughter they named Hope, who grew up hearing stories of the brave young woman whose short life had touched so many. And every year on the anniversary of the first Hope's death, Garrett would ride alone to the plateau overlooking the ranch, to remember the woman who had taught him that the value of life is measured not in its length but in its depth. And that love, true love, never really dies, it simply changes form, like the seasons of the Montana mountains she had so cherished.